Hi, I'm Rebecca and this is my breakdown for my visual effects project. Firstly, I wrote the script, basing the characters off my friends who would play them. Once the script was finalised, I made the storyboard. I then made up a call sheet for my friends, now actors, booked equipment and scheduled a shooting day. Preparing the set was not too difficult, particularly because I was using my own flat. One thing I did do was cover a window that doesn't have a curtain or blind. I decided to do this with wrapping paper. I made a running order and referenced my storyboard throughout the filming process. The filming went quite seamlessly and was lots of fun, but I found that I had a few continuity issues that meant some shots couldn't be included in the edit. Once I put a basic edit together, I found that the edit just seemed a little bit awkward at points, so it needed a bit of sound design. This is when I added an Atmos track, as well as a muffled track so that I could create the effect at the beginning where Alex takes off her headphones and we hear some commotion upstairs. The first effect I added were the toaster sparks. I did this by creating a path, animating it with trim paths, and then layering effects on top. For this in particular, I used wiggle paths, roughened edges, turbulent displace, and then a glow on a separate adjustment layer. Next, I made the black eyes effect. This was simply just a masked black solid layer around the eyes. I feathered the edges of the mask to help smooth out some of the movement, and I keyframed the mask path to the eyes. It was around this time that I decided I actually wanted to do a trailer, so I had to re-edit the basic storyline, but this did fix some continuity issues. I now created the search bar effect. This was quite simple, it's just a shape layer with a stroke for the box and a drop shadow to give it a little bit of depth. I added in a little magnifying glass, it was just a free vector from the internet, typed in the text, selected a typeface, and then added the typewriter effect. It did look good at this point, but I wanted to add the little line you get when typing. This was just a shape layer which I keyframed the position to move along with the typewriter effect. Next, I experimented with keying the opacity so that it disappeared in between letters. And at this point, I remembered that hold keyframes exist, and tried that on the opacity to get rid of the fades. It still didn't look quite right, and then I realised that hold keyframes actually need to be on the position, so I deleted all of the opacity keyframes and got the effect I was looking for. I thought that the walls in this beginning scene are quite empty, and so I created a poster in Photoshop for a fake rock band to put on the wall. Since the shot was static, I didn't need to do any tracking, but I did convert it to a 3D object so that I could manipulate all axes to make it seem flat against the wall. To blend it further, I added a subtle drop shadow and a bit of a blur around the edges. There's also this window ledge in the very first shot, and I think it distracts from the scene, so I wanted to fill it. I used generative fill for this. By just masking the area, After Effects was able to generate the rest of the wall. I added some photos to the scene as well, making sure they were all on the same 3D axes. I tried to align them from the top view to create the effect of them all being on the same wall. I played around with some of the curves to make the photos more similar in colour and shading. And finally, I just masked around each image in order to feather out the edges, just to stop them looking so crisp. The first title card needs to look quite different from the rest, but to keep some continuity, I used the same typeface. I layered a wood texture, a PNG of lined paper for the background, and then added the text with the typewriter effect. To make it a bit more interesting, I added a little bee on a simple path to fly into the scene. Because of the limitations of the bee being an image, I couldn't move his wings, but I thought I could add some movement using the wiggle expression. For the other title cards, I kept them quite simple, with just some text animation and a black background. The final special effect is where the demon is floating above the table. To achieve this, I needed to record with a green screen. After trying to match up the angle as best as possible, we filmed me balancing on a chair, which was easier said than done. We also had a surprise on the day practical effect where we taped my skirt to my legs. This was so that it didn't move around too much to make it harder to keyframe. Once I took this scene into After Effects, I immediately noticed all of the shadows on the green screen and realised I'd lit the room wrong. This was not ideal, but at this point I had plenty of practice with masking, so I masked around the head and the legs separately and keyed out the greens on 2 separate layers. After playing around with the keying settings, I was quite happy with how it was looking, and I needed to mask out the store, and I knew that this was going to leave a slightly odd bump under my back, but I tried to smooth it out as much as possible to create as natural of an effect. Finally, I added the shadows, which was 2 silhouetted versions of the demon's pre-comp. I adjusted the scale with some keyframes as the body moves up and down as well, to make it seem like she's actually moving closer and further away from the table. I've learnt a lot throughout this module, and it's given me lots of chance to play around with After Effects and to figure out some new ways to make some cool effects as well. I particularly enjoyed doing the green screen. It's quite a classic effect, and so getting it to look exactly how I wanted was definitely the most rewarding. Thank you for listening to my breakdown, and that's how I did it. Doing this module has given me a chance to consider the future of visual effects and where it can go with new technologies. I mentioned that one of my favourite effects to create was the green screen, and already some of the industry is moving on from the traditional green screen, with some productions leaning towards LED screens. I do think that traditional keying still has its benefits though, and perhaps artificial intelligence could be used to key out a wider range of green shades, accommodating for accidental shadows like the ones I came across myself. A mix of this and something like generative fill could also be used to fix green spill on subjects, making that traditional green screen a little bit more appealing again. The visual effects industry has already developed so rapidly from its beginnings only around 100 years ago. And with new advancements in AI, I think the process of creating special effects will become easier and more accessible, which in turn means the possibilities of what can be created will only grow.